He swore to kill every Apache he saw until one saved his life in the desert. The water was gone, the horse was dead, and Boone Carter was 3 full days into what he knew, deep in his sun-cooked bones, should have been his final hunt. But something was wrong with this stretch of wasteland. The heat wasn't just heat. It was a physical weight, a monster pressing down on him, trying to squeeze the last drop of life out of his pores. His vision swam, the dehydration turning the familiar shapes of cactus and rock into distorted, shimmering demons. And the woman who found him, she was the last person on God's scorched earth who should have helped him. She appeared right when the buzzards had stopped being patient, when they'd started circling lower, their shadows like black coins flicking across his face. She moved with a slow, careful grace through the shimmering air, a ghost in the heat. Her hands, he remembered her hands being so steady as she tilted a water skin and poured a thin, cool stream between his cracked and bleeding lips. The water was life itself. But then her voice was soft, whispering words in a language that made every muscle in his body scream with recognition, with pure, unadulterated hate. Boone had sworn an oath. He'd sworn it on his brother's fresh grave, the dirt still loose and the air still thick with the smell of burned wood and blood. Every single Apache he ever encountered would pay for what they'd taken from him. It was a simple promise, a clean one. It was the only thing that had kept him walking for weeks, the only thing that kept his heart beating in his chest. It was his entire reason for being. So why was he still breathing? The woman worked through the long, brutal night. He drifted in and out of a burning fever, and every time he surfaced, she was there, pressing cool, damp cloths to his forehead, his neck, feeding him tiny sips of that precious, life-giving water. She never asked him a single question. She never demanded any answers. She just saved him. An act of kindness so profound and so completely out of place that it felt like another kind of violence. But when the morning came and the fever finally cracked like a shattered piece of pottery, Boone opened his eyes and saw something that broke every rule he thought he knew. Every rule about survival, about enemies, about the desert, about the fire of vengeance that had been his only companion. The woman was gone. But there on the ground beside him, drawn with impossible precision in the sand, was a symbol of her tribe, a symbol that just yesterday would have sent his hand snapping for the colt at his hip. Instead, it left him choking on a question that would chase him across every mile of scorched earth that lay ahead. A question that was now a far heavier burden than his grief. What does it mean when the person you've sworn to destroy becomes the only reason you're still alive? 3 weeks earlier, Boone Carter had been a completely different man. A man who believed in things like fairness, hard work, and the simple logic of the world. He'd owned land, good land that he'd carved out of the wilderness with his own 2 hands. He raised cattle, tough, resilient longhorns that were the talk of the territory. He believed the world, for the most part, made sense. Then the raid came, a bloody nightmare that ripped through the dead of night and tore his world apart. His younger brother Marcus had been visiting. He'd ridden in from town bringing the latest news, a bag of peppermint sticks, and a bottle of good whiskey to celebrate their most successful roundup yet. They were laughing, planning for the future, the whiskey warm in their bellies. They never, ever saw the attack coming. One moment there was the peaceful sound of crickets. The next, the world exploded in screams and fire. When the dawn finally broke, its gentle pink light fell on a scene from hell. Marcus lay cold in the dirt, his eyes wide open to a sky he couldn't see. His blood had soaked into the very earth Boone had worked so hard to claim, a dark, ugly stain that would never wash away. The raiders had taken his best horses, burned his barn to the ground, and left him with absolutely nothing but a grief so vast it felt like a physical wound, and a rage that burned hotter than the flames that had consumed his home. Standing over his brother's body, the smell of smoke and death thick in his nostrils, Boone had made a promise that felt like it was forged from iron in his chest. He would track down every last Apache involved in that raid. He would find them, and he would make them pay for the life they'd stolen. He would not eat. He would not sleep. He would not rest until his justice, was served. For weeks, that promise was all that mattered. He followed their trail across the harsh, unforgiving landscape. He wasn't a tracker by nature, but hate is a powerful teacher. He learned to read the faintest signs in the dust, to spot the trace of their movements across hard, rocky ground. He learned to survive on a handful of jerky and a mouthful of water a day. His pursuit had become his entire existence. It was a pilgrimage of vengeance. And now, here he was, collapsed in the sand, his lips cracked open, his vision a useless blur, realizing his grand hunt might end before it had ever truly begun. The desert was claiming him, swallowing him whole, just as it had swallowed so many others who had dared to venture too far from the safe, predictable world of men. But then those gentle hands had lifted his head. Cool water had touched his mouth. And a voice he should have feared more than death itself, whispered words of comfort as the darkness finally closed in. Consciousness returned to him slowly, piece by painful piece, like surfacing from the bottom of a deep, dark well. The first thing he felt was shade, a blessed relief from the relentless sun that had been trying to bake him alive. Then he noticed the softness of woven blankets beneath his back. His throat was raw, but it wasn't the bone-dry razor-blade agony he remembered. Someone had been giving him water. Continuously. His eyes fluttered open. He was in a makeshift shelter, cleverly constructed from brush and a stretched piece of canvas, blocking out the worst of the desert sun. Beside him, within easy reach, sat a clay pot filled with cool, clean water. Next to it, strips of dried meat were arranged neatly on a flat stone. The care was methodical. It was purposeful. Someone didn't just want him to not die. Someone wanted him to live. "You're awake." The voice came from just outside the shelter. It was female, speaking English with an accent he couldn't quite place. "Don't try to sit up yet. The sun poisoning takes a long time to leave your body." Boone turned his head, a slow, careful movement that sent a spike of pain through his neck. Through the opening, he could see a woman's silhouette against the harsh, bright light. She moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency, tending a small, smokeless fire, organizing a small collection of supplies. Everything about her actions, every single movement, suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. She was at home here, in this place that had almost killed him. "Who are you?" His voice came out as a dry, pathetic croak. "Someone who found you dying." She didn't turn or look toward the shelter. Her focus remained on her task. "Someone who decided you deserved to live." The simple, direct honesty of her answer unsettled him more than any lie could have. In Boone's experience, people always had reasons for their actions, usually selfish ones. Nobody helped a complete stranger in the middle of nowhere without expecting something in return. Yet here he was, weak as a kitten, completely at her mercy, alive only because of this woman's inexplicable kindness. It didn't make sense. None of it did. Throughout the long day, she continued her silent care. She brought him water. She brought him small amounts of food, encouraging him to eat slowly. When his fever spiked again in the afternoon, she was there, changing the cool cloth on his forehead without a word. She mixed some bitter herbs into a tea that, despite its taste, seemed to ease the burning fire in his throat. But she never came close enough for him to see her face clearly. She was always a silhouette, a shadow, a voice from just beyond his reach. "Why won't you let me see you?" Boone finally asked during one of her visits to refill his water pot. She paused, her hand hovering over the clay pot. "Because you might not like what you see." "I don't understand." You will. There was a deep sadness in her voice, a note of resignation that he couldn't begin to interpret. When you're stronger, everything will become clear. As the second day passed, Boone's strength slowly began to return. The world stopped tilting every time he moved his head. His vision sharpened from a blurry mess into something approaching clarity. His thoughts, which had been a tangled, feverish knot, started to become clearer, more linear. And with that clarity, his memory of the past few weeks came flooding back in a brutal, painful rush. The raid, Marcus's death, his sworn oath of vengeance, the burning, all-consuming need to track down those responsible and make them pay. He tried to sit up, testing his muscles. They were weak, they protested, but they responded. Soon he would be able to travel again. Soon he could get back on the trail and continue his hunt. This brief delay, this strange interlude, would cost him valuable time, but he was alive. In the end, that was what mattered. "You saved my life," he called out to his mysterious rescuer, his voice stronger now. "I need to thank you properly. I need to see your face." A long, heavy silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of the wind whispering through the brush. Finally, she spoke from somewhere just beyond the shelter's opening. "Are you certain you want that, Boone Carter?" she asked, and her voice was different now, colder. "Are you absolutely sure you're ready to know who pulled you back from death's door?" His blood went cold. She knew his name. The sound of his own name from her lips was like a gunshot in the quiet desert. She knew who he was. And if she knew his name, she knew what he'd been doing out here in the desert, which meant she probably knew about his brother, about the raid, about the sacred promise he'd made over Marcus's grave. "How do you know my name?" The question came out harder than he'd intended, laced with a suspicion that was rapidly overpowering his gratitude. "The same way I knew you were dying of thirst 50 miles from the nearest water." Her voice seemed to move around the small camp as she continued her tasks. "The same way I knew you'd been tracking my people across this wasteland for weeks." Her people. The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. And suddenly, in one horrifying, sickening instant, everything made a terrible, impossible kind of sense. Her people. Boone's hand instinctively shot toward his belt, his fingers scrabbling for the familiar, comforting weight of the gun that wasn't there. His weapons were gone. His horse, his supplies, everything. He was defenseless. Worse than defenseless. He was alone in the desert, being nursed back to health by one of the very people he had sworn an oath to kill. "Looking for this?" The woman stepped into view for the very first time, holding his heavy revolver in her hands. She was younger than her voice had suggested, maybe 25 at the most. She had long, dark hair braided neatly down her back and skin the color of polished bronze from countless hours under the desert sun. Her clothes were a practical mixture of traditional Apache dress and sturdy frontier wear, leather boots, a woven skirt, a simple cotton shirt. She was beautiful, in a fierce, untamed way that made his chest tighten with a storm of confusion and fear. "You're Apache." The words came out flat, dead, an accusation and a statement of fact all at once. "My name is Ayanna," she said, her voice calm. She set his gun down carefully on a large rock, well beyond his reach. "And yes, I am Apache. The same people you've been hunting across this wasteland like a rabid dog." Boone struggled to push himself up, ignoring the protest of his weak limbs. Then why? The question burned in his throat, tasting of ash and confusion. "Why save me? Why would you do this?" Ayanna knelt beside the small fire, her movements as calm and deliberate as if they were discussing the weather. "Because you were dying," she said simply. "Because leaving someone to die of thirst in the desert, even an enemy, is not our way." "Your way." Boone spat the words, his voice growing harder, fueled by the returning tide of his rage. Your people killed my brother. They burned my home to the ground. They destroyed everything I ever worked for. Did they? She looked at him directly for the first time, and her dark eyes were unwavering, holding a depth he couldn't fathom. Or is that just what you want to believe? The question hit him like a slap in the face. I saw the bodies. I saw the blood. I saw the destruction they left behind. You saw the aftermath of violence. Ayanna corrected him gently, poking at the fire with a stick, sending a small shower of sparks into the evening air. But did you see who caused it? Did you actually witness the attack? Or did you simply decide we were responsible because it was easier than looking for the truth? Boone felt his cast-iron certainty waver for just a second, a tiny crack in the foundation of his hate. Then he pushed the doubt away, slamming the door on it. Apache raiders hit my land. They killed Marcus. That's all I need to know. Is it? She stood up and walked to the rock where his gun lay. She picked it up. Then take this. Take your weapon and finish what you came here to do. I saved your life, but I won't stop you from throwing it away on a lie. She held out the revolver to him, handle first. Boone stared at it, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. This was what he'd wanted for weeks. This was his chance for justice, for revenge. His chance to keep the promise he'd made over his brother's grave. This was his purpose. But his hand wouldn't move. It was as if it was carved from stone. You can't do it. Ayanna's voice was soft, almost sad, as if she was watching a tragedy unfold. You know something is wrong with your story, don't you? Some small part of you realizes that good people don't typically save the lives of their mortal enemies. You don't know what you're talking about, he snarled, but the words felt hollow, a desperate bluff. Even as he said it, he felt the foundation of his rage beginning to crack, to crumble under the weight of her impossible kindness. Ayanna sat back down, but she kept the gun extended toward him, an open offering. 3 days ago, you were ready to die rather than abandon your hunt. You pushed yourself until your body gave out. Now you can't even take a weapon from the hands of someone you claim to hate with every fiber of your being. She held his gaze. What changed, Boone Carter? He couldn't answer. He couldn't answer because the truth of it, the simple, terrifying truth, was too enormous to acknowledge. What had changed was her. Night fell across the desert like a heavy velvet blanket, bringing with it a surprising cold that seemed impossible after the day's brutal, punishing heat. Ayanna had built up the fire, and without being asked, she had shared her blankets with him, making sure he was warm. Every gesture of continued kindness towards a man who had openly threatened her. People made Boone's stomach twist with a confusing knot of guilt and suspicion he didn't want to name. Tell me about your brother, she said quietly, her voice soft across the crackling flames that separated them. Why would you want to know? He asked, his tone still wary. Because anger like yours doesn't just come from nowhere. It comes from love that has nowhere left to go. She pulled her own blanket tighter around her shoulders, her eyes reflecting the firelight. What was Marcus like? Despite himself, despite every instinct telling him to stay silent and hateful, Boone found the words beginning to come. He was younger than me, by 5 years, always laughing, you know. He was always seeing the good in people. He trusted everyone, believed every single person deserved a second chance, no matter what they'd done. His voice caught, a painful lump forming in his throat. It got him killed. You blame yourself. It wasn't a question. It was a simple statement of fact, and Boone didn't deny it. I should have been more careful. I should have posted guards, built better defenses. Marcus just came to celebrate our successful cattle drive. He came to celebrate with me, and I let him walk right into a death trap. The words tasted like poison. Ayanna studied his face in the flickering firelight, her expression unreadable. Describe the attack. Tell me exactly what you found when you woke up. Why does it matter now? Because I need to understand what really happened that night. Every detail. The memories came flooding back, each one as sharp and painful as a shard of broken glass. I woke up to screaming. My own, I think. By the time I got my boots on and got outside, the barn was already a sea of flames. Marcus. He was lying in the dirt near the corral. He'd been shot twice, in the chest. The horses were gone, all of them. The cattle were scattered to the four winds. What else? She pressed gently. What signs did you find? Tracks. Tracks leading north. Apache moccasins, clear as day in the mud near the water trough. And there was war paint, smeared on the fence posts. A warning. His hands clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists at his sides. It was clear who was responsible. There was no question. Ayanna was quiet for a long, long moment, just staring into the fire. Finally, she looked at him. Boone, when exactly did this attack happen? 6 weeks ago, the night of the new moon. She shook her head slowly, a sad, deliberate movement. 6 weeks ago, on the night of the new moon, my people were 300 miles north of your land. We were gathered for the harvest ceremonies, a sacred time for us. We were preparing for the coming winter. Every single member of our band, every man, woman, and child, was accounted for. You're lying. The accusation was automatic, a reflex. I'm telling you the truth, she said, her voice steady. A truth you're not ready to hear. Not yet. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. The tracks you found. The war paint you saw. Someone wanted you to believe we were responsible. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make it look that way. But we weren't there, Boone. We couldn't have been. Boone felt the solid ground of his hatred shifting beneath him, turning to quicksand. Then who? The question was a hoarse whisper. That, she said, is what we need to figure out. Ayanna reached into a small leather pouch at her side and pulled out something that made his breath catch in his throat, a sharp, painful gasp. It was Marcus's pocket watch, the old silver one their father had given him years ago before he died. An heirloom. I found this at a trading post 2 days' ride from here, she said softly. The man who was selling it, he had pale skin and spoke English without an accent. How did you know it was Marcus's? He stammered, his mind reeling. Because carved into the back are the initials MC, and because the man who was bragging about it said he took it off a dead rancher after raiding his spread. Her eyes met his across the fire, and in their depths he saw not malice, but a shared grief. He said the job was supposed to look like Indian work, but the pay was too good to pass up. The revelation hit Boone with the force of a physical blow. It was like the world had tilted on its axis. Everything he'd believed, everything he'd built his consuming rage upon for the last 6 weeks, was crumbling around him, turning to dust. It was a lie. All of it. A carefully constructed lie. What man? Who hired him? That's what I was trying to find out when I came across your trail. Ayanna carefully tucked the precious watch back into her pouch. You weren't the only one seeking justice for what happened that night, Boone Carter. I've been tracking the real killers for weeks. The fire crackled between them, the only sound in the vast, silent desert as the full, crushing weight of her words settled over him. He'd spent 6 long weeks hunting innocent people, consumed by a blind, misplaced hatred, while the actual murderers, the men who had put 2 bullets in his brother's chest, remained free. Marcus's blood was still crying out for justice from the ground, but he'd been shouting his rage in all the wrong places. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? His voice was thick with a shame that was even heavier than his grief had been. Because you needed to be ready to hear it, Ayanna said simply. She stood up and moved to the edge of their small camp, looking out into the immense darkness. And because what comes next is going to require us to work together. Dawn came with a cold, sharp clarity that seemed to strip away more than just the darkness of the night. As Boone sat by the dying embers of their fire, he felt 6 weeks of white-hot rage slowly, painfully, transform into something far harder to bear. Shame. A deep, corrosive shame that ate at his soul. Every single step he'd taken in his righteous pursuit of vengeance had been built on a lie that had nearly gotten him killed, and a lie that he had been ready to kill for. "You're wondering if you can trust me," Ayanna said. She emerged from behind a cluster of rocks where she'd been keeping watch, her movements silent as a cat. "You're wondering if this is all some elaborate trap." He was wondering exactly that. It was too much, too fast. His entire reality had been upended. "How do I know you're telling the truth about my brother? About any of this?" Without saying a word, she walked to her pack and reached inside. She pulled out more than just the pocket watch this time. There were Marcus's worn leather riding gloves, the ones with the tear on the left thumb, his silver belt buckle, a gift from Boone on his last birthday, and a torn piece of his favorite blue shirt, the one he'd been wearing that night. Items that Boone recognized with a painful, soul-crushing certainty. "I bought these from 3 different men at 3 different trading posts," Ayanna said quietly, laying them on a blanket between them. All of them told the same story. They'd been hired to raid your ranch and make it look like Apache work. The man who hired them paid in freshly minted gold coin and promised them a bonus if they spread the word that it was Indian raiders. Boone reached out with a shaking hand and took the items. The piece of shirt still smelled faintly of Marcus's pipe tobacco. The ghost of his brother felt so close in that moment, it was unbearable. Who hired them? Who would do this? "A man named Cornelius Webb," Ayanna said, her voice hard. She began breaking camp with swift, efficient movements. "He owns the largest spread in the territory, about a 3 days' ride north of your ranch. He's been buying up land from desperate ranchers for the last 2 years, sometimes waiting for a tragedy to make them desperate." The name meant nothing to Boone, but the ugly pattern was becoming sickeningly clear. He stages the attacks, blames the Apache, and then he offers to buy out the terrified ranchers at a fraction of what their land is actually worth. "Exactly," Ayanna confirmed. "And when ranchers like you and your brother refuse to sell, accidents happen." She rolled her blankets tightly, her movements sharp and angry. "Your brother's death wasn't some random act of violence, Boone. It was business. Cold, calculated business." The cold, brutal calculation behind Marcus's murder made Boone's stomach turn. His brother hadn't died in some desperate raid for supplies or horses. He'd died as a line item in a rich man's ledger. A problem to be solved as part of a land grab scheme. It was somehow dirtier, uglier, and worse than anything he had ever imagined. "Why are you helping me?" The question had been burning in him since the previous night, a constant, nagging mystery. "Your people have no reason to care about justice for a white rancher. After what men like me have done." Ayanna paused in her packing, her back to him. "Webb's men didn't just raid your ranch, Boone. 2 weeks after they hit you, they hit an Apache family that was camped near the river. They made it look like retaliation from angry settlers for your brother's death." She turned to face him, and her eyes were filled with a fire he hadn't seen before. "A grandmother and her young grandson were killed. The survivors, they were my cousins." Now he understood. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This was never just about helping him. It was about stopping a monster who was using racial hatred as a weapon, a tool to turn them against each other while he got rich. He was a poison that was infecting the entire territory, setting everyone at each other's throats for his own gain. "So what do we do?" Boone asked, his voice low but steady. "We do what you should have done 6 weeks ago," she said, shouldering her pack. "We find the real killers and we make them pay. But not with bullets and anger, with evidence and justice." Boone stood up slowly, testing his strength. The desert had nearly killed him, but Ayana's care had brought him back from the brink. He was still weak, his body ached, but a cold, hard determination was replacing the exhaustion in his limbs. "You could have let me die out there," he said, looking at her. "It would have been easier than all of this." "Easier isn't always right," Ayana replied. She walked over to the rock and picked up his gun. She held it out to him, handle first, just as she had before. "The question is, can you put aside 6 weeks of blind hatred long enough to do what actually needs to be done?" Boone took the weapon. The familiar weight of it in his hand was no longer a comfort, but a heavy responsibility. He holstered it without hesitation. "Lead the way." For the first time since he'd known her, a genuine smile touched Ayana's lips. It transformed her entire face, revealing a warmth that had been hidden beneath layers of caution, grief, and sadness. "Then we go north. Webb's ranch is heavily guarded, but I think there's a way to get the proof we need." She started walking, heading north across the desert floor, moving with the confident, easy stride of someone who knew exactly where she was going. "I hope you're ready to pretend to be someone you're not, Boone Carter." They traveled north for 2 full days. Boone, who had once prided himself on his knowledge of the land, felt like a child following Ayana. She followed paths that were completely invisible to him, but were as clearly marked in her mind as a highway. She moved through the landscape with a quiet confidence that spoke of a lifetime spent reading the subtle signs in the earth, the patterns of the sky, the behavior of distant birds. She was a part of this land in a way he never could be. On the second evening, as they crested a long, low ridge, Ayana stopped and motioned for him to get down. Below them, stretching across a wide valley, was the Webb Ranch, and Boone finally understood the sheer scale of what they were up against. The spread was immense, sprawling across a valley that should have belonged to at least 6 different, smaller ranchers. He could see cattle bearing 6 different brands grazing in newly fenced pastures, clear, stolen evidence of Webb's recent acquisitions. The main house was a huge, sprawling structure that practically screamed of wealth built quickly and without restraint. "He's been busy," Boone muttered, studying the operation through a pair of field glasses Ayana handed him. "Busier than you know," she said, her voice tight. She pointed to a cluster of buildings set off from the main house. "See those men coming and going from that bunkhouse? Those aren't regular ranch hands. Webb keeps a private army." Boone focused the glasses and counted at least 12 men, maybe more. All of them were heavily armed, and they moved with the purposeful, arrogant efficiency of hired guns, not cowboys. This wasn't a ranch, it was a fortress. "So, how do we get evidence against a man like that? We can't just ride in." "We don't break in," Ayana said, lowering herself behind the ridgeline so they were out of sight. "We get invited." She looked at him, her eyes serious. "Tomorrow is market day in Millfield, the nearest town. Webb always sends a wagon loaded with goods to sell, and at least 4 men to protect it. But he also sends his bookkeeper, the man who keeps the meticulous records of all his land deals, and more importantly, his payments to the raiders." She pulled a single worn ledger page from her pack and handed it to him. "I already have this, a sample page. I lifted it from the saddlebag of one of his hired guns a week ago. It shows the payments made to the men who killed your brother. But it's not enough. It's not enough for a court to act on." Boone examined the page. The handwriting was neat, precise, almost beautiful. It recorded payments for special services and land acquisition assistance with a chilling clinical detachment. "How did you get this?" "The man I bought Marcus's watch from was drunk and careless with his belongings," Ayana said, with a grim, tight smile. "But this is just one page. We need the complete records to prove the pattern, to show this wasn't a one-time thing." "And you think this bookkeeper is just going to hand them over to us?" "Not to me, no," she said, studying his face carefully in the fading light. "But he might just hand them over to a fellow businessman. Someone who looks like he's looking to buy some protection services. Boone understood immediately. The plan was audacious and terrifying. You want me to pose as a rancher, someone interested in hiring Webb's raiders. It's the only way to get close to the real evidence without getting shot, she confirmed. The bookkeeper's name is Thomas Hartwell. He drinks at the saloon every market day. He's proud of his work for Webb, and he tends to boast when he's had too much whiskey. That's our way in. The plan was incredibly dangerous. It required Boone to walk into the heart of enemy territory, unarmed in a way that mattered, and convince Webb's right-hand man that he was a potential client rather than a man whose life they had already destroyed. But it was also their only real chance to get the proof they needed to bring Webb down for good. "What about you?" he asked. "Webb's men might recognize you from the area." "They've never seen my face before. To men like that, I'm just another Apache who keeps to the shadows," she said, a bitter edge to her voice. Ayanna began sketching a rough map of the town in the dirt. "But I'll be close. I'll be watching. If things go wrong, I'll be close enough to help." As she outlined the details of their dangerous plan, Boone found himself watching her face, the way it was illuminated by the last rays of the setting sun. 6 weeks ago, he would have looked at this woman and seen only an enemy, a target. Now, he saw someone whose courage and intelligence commanded his deepest respect, someone who had saved his life in the desert and was now risking her own to help him find a justice that was for both of their peoples. "Ayanna," he said, her name feeling strange on his tongue, but right. "When this is over, when Webb pays for what he did, when this is over, you'll go back to your ranch and rebuild what was taken from you," she finished for him. Her voice was matter-of-fact, but something flickered in her eyes, something he couldn't quite read. "And I'll return to my people." "Is that what you want?" he asked, the question more important than he wanted to admit. She didn't answer right away. She stared down at the distant, twinkling lights of the ranch below them, a den of thieves and murderers. Finally, she looked away. "What I want stopped mattering the day I decided to save a dying man's life in the desert." The saloon in Millfield was a tired, dusty place that reeked of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and broken dreams. Boone adjusted the brim of his hat lower over his eyes, trying to look casual as he scanned the crowded, noisy room for Thomas Hartwell. Ayanna had described him perfectly, a thin, nervous man with slicked-back hair and expensive clothes that didn't quite fit his twitchy bookkeeper's frame. And there he was, sitting alone at a corner table, already 3 drinks into what appeared to be a long and intimate session with a bottle of whiskey. Boone bought a drink at the bar and approached the table slowly, moving with a confidence he didn't feel. "Mind if I sit? Place is packed today." Hartwell looked up with bleary, suspicious eyes. "Free country, I suppose." His words were already slightly slurred, just as Ayanna had predicted. "Thomas Hartwell, isn't it?" Boone said, settling into the chair opposite him. "My name's Johnson. I've heard good things about your employer's business ventures." The bookkeeper straightened up, puffing out his narrow chest with obvious pride. "Mr. Webb runs the most successful operation in this territory, always expanding, always profitable." "That's exactly what I wanted to hear." Boone leaned closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "See, I'm looking to expand my own holdings, but I've been having some Indian problems. Heard Mr. Webb has effective ways of dealing with such issues." Hartwell's eyes sharpened, a flicker of cunning intelligence cutting through the alcoholic haze. "What kind of problems?" "Apache raiders," Boone said, letting the genuine pain of his memory color his voice. "Hit my spread last month, burned me out, killed my partner. I rebuilt, but I know they'll be back. I need the kind of protection that sends a permanent message, if you catch my meaning. Mr. Webb does provide certain specialized services for fellow ranchers who are having similar difficulties." Hartwell glanced around the noisy saloon, then leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "But it ain't cheap, and it ain't pretty." "I'm not looking for pretty," Boone said, his voice hard as stone. "I'm looking for effective." The bookkeeper, his ego stoked and his judgment clouded by the whiskey, pulled a small, thick leather journal from the inside pocket of his coat. "See, the beauty of Mr. Webb's system," he bragged, "is that nobody ever suspects the truth. An Apache attack your ranch? Well, that's just a tragedy. So you sell cheap and move on, or you hire the kind of protection that actually works. Either way, Mr. Webb profits." Boone's heart hammered against his ribs as he caught a glimpse of the journal's contents. Page after page of meticulous damning records, names, dates, payments for raids, land purchase agreements, special services. It was all there. It was exactly what they needed. It was Webb's entire empire, written in blood and ink. "That's quite a system you've got there," Boone said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But how do I know it actually works?" "Works?" Hartwell let out a bitter, drunken laugh. "My friend, we have acquired 16 different spreads in the last 2 years using this exact method. Every single rancher was more than happy to sell after their Apache trouble started." He flipped through several pages, his finger tracing a line of figures. "Here's your proof. Payments to the raiders, purchase agreements, profit margins. Mr. Webb has built an empire on other men's fear." At that exact moment, Boone saw Ayanna move past the saloon's wide front window, her prearranged signal that trouble was approaching. He looked toward the batwing doors and saw 2 big, armed men entering the saloon. They weren't cowboys. They were Webb's men from the ranch, and their eyes were scanning the crowd with a professional, predatory intensity. "Hartwell!" one of the men called out, his voice cutting through the saloon's chatter. "Boss wants to see you, now." The bookkeeper's face went pale, the drunken flush draining away in an instant. But I wasn't supposed to be back until this evening." "Plans changed," the gunman said, his gaze falling on Boone. "Who's your friend?" Boone stood up slowly, letting his hand rest casually near the grip of his gun. "Just a fellow rancher," he said calmly. "Interested in doing some business with Mr. Webb." "Is that so?" The gunman stepped closer, his eyes cold and hard. "Funny thing is, we just got word that someone's been asking a lot of questions about Mr. Webb's business practices up and down this territory. Someone matching your description." The saloon grew quiet as the other patrons sensed the dangerous shift in the tension. Hartwell clutched his precious journal to his chest, suddenly, terrifyingly sober, realizing just how much he had revealed to a complete stranger. "There's been a misunderstanding," Boone said, his voice even and steady. "No misunderstanding at all," the second gunman said. He had worked his way around behind Boone's chair, trapping him. "You're coming with us. We're going to have a little chat with the boss, both of you." Through the window, Boone could see Ayanna positioning herself near the hitching posts where the horses were tied. Their careful plan was falling apart, imploding right in front of them. But they still had one advantage. Webb's men didn't know about her. "After you," Boone said, gesturing toward the door with a calmness he didn't feel. As they moved outside into the harsh sunlight, he caught Ayanna's eye for just a fraction of a second and gave her the slightest nod. Whatever happened next, they would have to face it together. The journey back to Webb's ranch felt like riding toward his own execution. Boone sat his horse with his hands bound tightly in front of him, flanked on both sides by Webb's silent, watchful gunmen. Ahead of them, Thomas Hartwell rode in a panicked, miserable silence. The bookkeeper still clutched his incriminating journal, completely unaware that the evidence he held would soon seal his powerful employer's fate, one way or another. As they approached the sprawling main house, Boone scanned the rocks above the ranch. He saw it then, a brief flash of movement, a flicker of shadow that could only be Ayanna. She had followed them, just as they'd planned for if things went wrong. She was in position. Cornelius Webb stood on his wide front porch like a king surveying his private domain. He was a large, soft man with pale, manicured hands and eyes as hard and cold as river stones. Everything about him spoke of wealth built on the suffering of others. "So," Webb said, his voice carrying the lazy, arrogant confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "You're the one who's been asking all the uncomfortable questions about my business." He gestured dismissively at the terrified bookkeeper. "Hartwell here got a little loose with his tongue, didn't he?" I was just trying to make a sale, sir," Hartwell stammered, his voice trembling. "He said he needed protection services." "Protection services," Webb laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Is that what we're calling it these days?" He stepped off the porch and walked closer to Boone, looking him up and down like a piece of livestock. "You know what I call it? Good business. You take land nobody wants to sell, you make it available, you buy it cheap. It's the American way." "You call murder good business," Boone said quietly, his voice tight with a rage he could barely control. "Murder is such an ugly word," Webb said with a sigh, gesturing to his sprawling, stolen ranch. "I prefer to think of it as problem-solving. Your brother Marcus, for instance. He was a problem, a stubborn one. Wouldn't sell his land no matter how generous my offers became." The casual, smug admission of guilt hit Boone like a physical blow, but before he could respond, chaos erupted all around them. Ayanna appeared from 3 directions at once, or at least that's how it seemed to Webb's confused men. She had positioned small, polished pieces of metal in the rocks above, creating multiple reflections of herself in the bright sunlight, making it impossible to tell her actual location. In the ensuing confusion, she put 2 loud shots into the air and shouted a war cry in Apache, her voice echoing off the rocks, making it sound like a much larger force was attacking. "Apache raid!" one of Webb's men yelled, falling for the trap exactly as she'd planned. In the sudden panic, Boone threw himself from his horse, using the momentum to roll toward the porch where Webb stood frozen in shocked surprise. He tackled the larger man at the knees, and they crashed through the wooden porch railing in a tangle of fists and fury. "You killed my brother for a piece of land!" Boone roared, driving his fist deep into Webb's soft stomach. "You destroyed families, and you blamed innocent people." Webb, surprised by the ferocity of the attack, managed to pull a wicked-looking knife from a sheath in his boot, but Boone was faster, fueled by weeks of rage and grief. He pinned the man's wrist against the hard-packed dirt until he cried out in pain and dropped the weapon. By the time the dust and confusion had settled, Ayanna had Webb's remaining men at gunpoint, while the terrified Hartwell cowered behind an overturned table, his precious journal scattered in the dirt around him like fallen leaves. "It's over, Webb," Boone said, breathing heavily as he stood over the defeated, groaning man. "Hartwell's records show everything. The payments to the raiders, the staged attacks, the land grabs. You're finished." 3 hours later, the territorial marshal arrived with a full posse. Thomas Hartwell, faced with the stark choice between hanging alongside his boss or testifying against him, chose survival. His detailed, tearful confession, backed up by the undeniable evidence in his own meticulous journal, painted a picture of systematic fraud, terror, and murder that shocked even the hardened veteran lawman. Cornelius Webb was loaded into a prison wagon, his ill-gotten land empire crumbling to dust around him. The families he'd driven off their land would get their property back. The men he'd hired to masquerade as Apache raiders would be hunted down and face justice. As the dust settled and the law enforcement rode away with their prisoners, Boone found himself standing alone with Ayanna beside the very corral where his brother had died, the place where it all began. "It's finished," she said quietly. "Yes." He looked at her, this woman who had saved his life in more ways than one. This woman who had pulled him from the desert and then pulled him out of the darkness of his own hatred. "What happens now?" "Now, You go back to your ranch, she said, her voice soft. You rebuild what was taken. You live the life that Marcus would have wanted you to live. And you? He asked. She was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the horizon. I return to my people. I will tell them that justice was served for my cousins, that the real killers have been caught. Boone stepped closer to her, closing the small distance between them. That's not what I meant, and you know it. Ayanna finally met his eyes, and in their dark depths, he saw his own complicated feelings reflected back at him. Hope, fear, and something deeper, something stronger, that neither of them had dared to name out loud. I saved the life of a man who swore an oath to kill every Apache he saw, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. What kind of future could we possibly have? The kind where that man learned he was wrong, Boone said, his voice thick with emotion. Wrong about everything that mattered. He reached out and took her hand. The kind where two people who found each other in the middle of the desert decide that some things are worth fighting for. Together. She smiled then. The same smile that had transformed her face days earlier in the desert, but it was warmer now, fuller, filled with a future of possibility. Your ranch will need a lot of rebuilding, she said, her fingers tightening around his. I suppose someone should probably make sure you don't make the same mistakes twice. As they rode south together, toward his land, toward whatever future they could build from the ashes of their pasts, Boone realized that his brother Marcus had been right all along. Everyone did deserve a second chance, even men who had been consumed by hatred, even those who'd sworn terrible oaths they never should have made. Sometimes, salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes, the people you think are your greatest enemies turn out to be the only ones who can save your soul. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Your support means everything to us.